starting with a spectrum. So can you see that line? This is weird because of the delay. Oh yeah, you can. Okay. So we're starting with just this line of a spectrum. And some of you have seen this before because I've taught before about the idea of the spectrum of poison and medicine, or the spectrum of nourishment. And this is really an idea that has to do with concentration, as we talked about before. That beginning of the word medicine, that med part of the word, has to do with like meditation, which is about concentration. It has to do with this ability to consider, think over, and then there's also that aspect of medicine, like we talked about, that has to do with like the literal concentration and power of a substance. So if we think about this spectrum, on one side we'll say maybe like, low concentration, and on the other side we'll say high. And I have to get my notes from this other side. So we might see that like here on this low concentration side of things, you would have like the food as medicine, right? Like part of what happens when you're eating a healthy, balanced diet is that you're getting not only all the nutrients that you need, which you want it to be concentrated enough that you meet your caloric needs, but you don't want it to be so highly concentrated that you are actually overfed and overnourished. We have a lot of challenges relating to overly saturated foods, overly calorically dense, but nutrient poor. So you don't want too high a concentration of any one thing. You want this kind of balance of lots of different constituents. As you start to have more particular needs or stronger need for food to be healing and therapeutic, maybe you start to need a little bit more concentration of particular kinds of compounds. So maybe you have to really push the greens and the berries and the anti-inflammatory foods, and increase the concentration of that. So maybe you're starting to pump up your diet in these certain ways. But we're still on this relatively low concentration end of things. And then, around here in kind of the middle part of the spectrum, you start to get into some herbs, right? Like herbs are not that different from spinach. If you are working with nettles, for example, you're working with raspberry leaf, you're working with these herbs that are primarily nourishing. They're maybe more concentrated in certain nutrients and certain phytochemicals than your spinach would be, but it's not a huge difference. And so you're in kind of this food-like territory where, just like with food, it's generally very safe. We're not dealing with poison of any kind. The concentration is not so high that it's either going to really like make you or break you. And then as we continue going along this spectrum, maybe we get toward the plants that have a lot more alkaloids. We get into the plants that have a lot stronger effects. We start getting a little further into the plants that are potentially toxic. We go a little further into plants, or maybe they're not specifically toxic, but if you take too much, you can get some stomach upset. You can actually start to get some side effects. Keep going a little further, and we're into the poisons. And then, keep going a little further, or just kind of in that same general zone, we really concentrate things and refine them so that all we have is one molecule repeated for 600 milligrams, and now we have a pharmaceutical drug. And it's very concentrated, and there is both a lot of potential for strongly moving the physiology in a direction, and there's also, it's quite concentrated, so there's danger. There's more danger here. So that's this first level of the spectrum. It's the concentration piece. And this is how I talked about safety and efficacy and the range of options when we talk about, what are we talking about when we talk about conventional medicine versus herbal medicine? This is a lot of how I spoke about it before. But as I was getting ready for this class today, and partly maybe because I've been reading a lot of Jung, I realized we have to make another line on this diagram and turn this into a quaternity. So now we have another spectrum on the spectrum, and this vertical line is the spectrum of conversation. And you have to forgive me now because this is certainly my theater background encroaching. And this spectrum of conversation has to do with how your approach to medicine and how medicine's approach to you is different, and rightly so, depending on the severity and the extremity of where you are. Hopefully, that's what it's based on. Sometimes it's based on other things, but we can get into that. So down here at the bottom, where there's no conversation, this is like we're in a dire situation and you just got hit by a bus. We're not going to have a big discussion about trying to get informed consent from you because you are unconscious. So the EMTs are going to assume that you give consent for treatment and they are going to take care of you. Similarly, we have Good Samaritan laws in place in most states in the United States where if someone is passed out, unconscious, and you are a Good Samaritan, you come and you try to do CPR, and as usually happens with CPR, you break a rib or two, that you cannot be sued for breaking their ribs while trying to save their life because it is assumed that they can't consent. And instead of being charged with assault, it is understood that there wasn't a possibility to have a conversation in this really extreme circumstance. So that's one side, one way that medicine can be engaging with you without a conversation. And that would be in this, this might show up backwards on here. So now I have to wait for this screen to catch up and tell me. Oh no, it shows up right. Okay, good. So this part right here is, high concentration, so high focus, potency, intensity of the medicine being applied, and low conversation. The most extreme part of this quadrant is going to be the place where it's an emergency and we just have to do what we have to do. And maybe the risks are high, but the risks are high kind of either way, so we're going to do everything that we can, right? No conversation, high concentration. On this other side, where there's not conversation, this is a kind of a whole other experience. This is what I'm going to call, or what Dale Pendle, our friend from last week, kind of calls like the ground state. And this is a place where we're rather unconscious about our health, and we maybe don't think we're engaging with medicine at all. So there's not a lot of conversation, and there's also just not a lot of concentration. So for example, taking a daily vitamin falls into this place for most people. It's not something they're thinking about or talking about quite a lot. Just, getting regular sleep, if nothing is wrong with it, is sort of falling into this place. Eating a reasonably good diet, but also it's not a particularly therapeutic diet, all of that kind of falls into this not a lot of conversation and not a lot of concentration either. So it's a relatively safe place to be as long as you are self-aware and are able to notice if something changes and goes wrong. As the conversation increases, there are two ways that I think we can conceive of what conversation means when we're talking about herbal medicine. So one thing that conversation means is like dialogue with your providers, making sure that you understand and have active choices in everything that you receive as part of your healing. Talking through your options, informed consent, all of this good stuff. But the magic about herbal medicine is that conversation is not limited to the conversations that you can have with other humans who are helping you with your care. Plants communicate with us, though most of us don't experience that communication in words. There are many plant people who report experiencing these kinds of communications in words. I am not one of them, but I am also not here to debate other people's experiences that are subjective. But it isn't necessary to understand a plant in a human language in order to have a conversation with that plant. Part of what makes herbal medicine so great is that when you take in an herb, it is very likely to have some effect on your digestive process. And kind of like with food, like you're going to absorb certain parts of it and then other parts of it not so much absorb. And there's actually a dialogue that happens between your body and the herbs that you ingest. Whereas in an ideal world, when you take a pharmaceutical drug, generally with first generation drugs, there are now certain drugs that are designed to break down in a certain way at a certain speed at different stages, that those are a little more like a conversation. And actually you can plot those that way on this graph. That's totally fine. But most of the time with a pharmaceutical drug, it's like, well, your levels are here and we want them to be here. So the drug is going to go like that. And we don't expect or want your body to have anything to say about that going differently. We want it to do exactly what we expect. And we're going to monitor the dose carefully, and we've studied the pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics, and we're going to make it happen like that. With herbs, that's not so much the framework, usually. So that's one kind of conversation that can happen and can be elevated. One reason why you might choose to work with herbal remedies in addition to or instead of pharmaceutical remedies is if you want to increase the conversation quotient, because that's what you need for your healing. The other piece of the conversation that isn't necessarily with your providers is the conversation that you have with yourself, with your understanding of a spiritual, something greater than yourself, your place in the world. And this is a little bit about what that second poem was talking about, is that part of medicine is this understanding and appreciation and this opening, right, the cave that leads us to what we want most, into something that is actually greater, bigger, a bigger, better, wilder conversation than we were having before the initiation. That is also part of this spectrum too.